All right, so we're gonna bring Keith back up here. He's gonna talk about pre-permitting and habitat mapping assessments for some of his inshore reef developments.
Thanks, Bo. I want to also mention Bo has been a great help with some of the reef programs or artificial reef permits in Hernando, specifically Bendickson and the shallow reefs. And also, we've had a lot of great community support. The Port Authority there at Hernando County is one of the primary reasons why the reef program was kick-started again after 20 years. So that I think that's really a key component of reef projects in general. Is my past job, I worked on MFLs and minimum flows and rivers and regulatory type programs. There wasn't a lot of community support for those programs, but it's really nice to work on projects that have support from both fishermen and also just folks that care about conservation. So what I wanted to mention today was, or talk a little bit today, was some of the planning efforts we put into our projects and the permitting side. I also want to mention or go through why Hernando County has some unique challenges on the permitting side. And then I'm going to give you some examples of what we did on Bendickson on the shallow reef projects. And then what we're doing right now is try to find sites that meet that JAXPO. Is that what you're calling it?
Yeah.
SWIPO or JAXPO? So Hernando County, we are very blessed with lots of seagrass, and there's we have 5 times the amount of seagrass of all Tampa Bay. And this map doesn't show the entire coverage, but it does go out as far as 25 miles out in places off Hernando specifically. Pasco also has quite a bit of seagrass and as well as citrus. Of course, we all know how valuable and important those are to our fisheries and things like scallops and also just the spawning of grouper and how it supports a lot of other finfish. Here's just an aerial, combined aerial of some of the maps I used to work on at SwiftMud when I was doing seagrass mapping. So when you look at that, it doesn't look like there's a lot of places there to put artificial reefs. And yes, we are blessed with seagrass, but there's not a lot of connections between the shoreline and some of the hard bottom that's further offshore, especially in the south part of our county and also in Pasco County. There are quite a bit of hard bottom, shallow rock outcrops in the northern part of our county. They're the most dense. This was a map that I had put together during the oil spill while I was at the Water Management District to bring that to the state's attention that we had a lot of shallow rock outcrops out there that are very diverse, and that we need to consider those in the oil spill contingency plan. I think at that time they had planned to do some booming right along the marshes, but they weren't really concerned with the most critical habitat in my mind, which was the natural reefs there. So we have that, and we're not proposing any artificial reefs in this area. It's kind of our systematic master plan that UF helped develop. This is a recent drone shot of one of the marked rock outcrops. This is North Rack. So it's there's a lot of these scattered throughout that north part of the county that aren't mapped, and that we know where they are from some of the experience I have from mapping seagrass and also data from FWC. Some of these are very rich. I mean, we actually have coral, finger coral out there, which is Oculinus. Some of those are very old growth. Lots of sponges, about 10 different species of coral. So we're not proposing to build artificial reefs next to those, especially the ones that are going to be used for tourism. Oculina, I guess there are areas there that's some very old growth. That colony there below my son Cole is about 120 years old. So again, these are habitats we don't want to place reefs near. Another part of the mapping we look at, is the shrimping zones. This is one area we aren't blessed with, in my mind, because there's not a lot of places where we can put artificial reefs that aren't in the shrimping zones. There is the closed area within the 3 mile line, which is shown here in the red line right here. But a lot of those are too shallow to implement or install artificial reefs. And out in the further offshore, you have areas that are shrimping in crabbing zones that have different seasons. So that's something that we have to consider when we're doing artificial reefs. So we have a small number of artificial reefs in Hernando County. And the most recent was the addition to Bendickson, which is about 20 miles offshore, and then the 3 shallow water reefs, which we completed. But I thought I'd show you just some of the planning we went through on those new reefs and what tools we use. So really, I grab everything I can from my days at Swiftmud doing seagrass mapping. I've compiled or kept all the seagrass imagery and data layers we created, and also the data layers when we work with FWC. And FWC side scan, if we can find that, we'll borrow that from them. We recently did buy a new sonar unit at the advice of FWC, which has been working out really well. And then just your standard underwater cameras, and we have a decent underwater towable camera we use. Drones is another thing we've been using recently. And then the scuba survey, when you do actually find the site that works for deployment of a reef. There are a lot of tools out there for maps. This is the list that I use, going all the way back to '86. Some of that work was done by UF, Swiftmud, and then some of the projects I worked on while I was at Swiftmud, and then some of the more recent things that FWC has completed using worldview imagery. So all those are resources that you can use to plan and assess your pre-screen, your reef location. But as I mentioned, there were some challenges when I first came to Swiftmud, or to the county, and that was Bendickson. We had a permit, we were working on a permit modification. We had some site plans from an engineer that showed where we thought we could deploy material, and that's his site plan between the 10 Army tanks. Unfortunately, once FWC went out and looked at those sites, and we looked, the county looked at those sites, they were not good sites. They had a lot of hard bottom. Bendickson has 10 Army tanks that were deployed back in 1995, as well as some concrete rubble. So immediately, one of my first tasks was to get out there and do scuba surveys in February of 2016. Water temperature was 52, but we needed that data because there was a big push to get this project done. Unfortunately, we found a lot of hard bottom habitat between those tanks. So pulled some of this imagery. This was a tool I used from Swiftmud. This was recent aerial imagery flown in 2012. And just looking at light and dark spots, you can see that most of the sand is on the north side of that project. So that gave us a place to target to do the scuba surveys. And unfortunately, FWC came to the rescue and came out and did some side scans of that area as well. And we were able to use that to help find the sandy, all sand bear habitat substrate. Now this just shows you what the material is from the previous reef deployment. This was actually an area where the county originally thought they were going to deploy material on top of material that was already deployed in '95. So that wouldn't have worked. And this shows you a comparison of those sites. You've got, this is the area that was planned to deploy, and there was already a lot of material. So that was a challenge, and we did resolve that with different tools, and we were able to get the permit modified and deploy where there is just sand and no hard bottom. So we had the 3 areas there, and Chuck had mentioned we deployed this in August, including some modules that were donated by Colleen Marine. Next, I want to talk to you a little about the shallow water reefs, because that's the one that has had some concerns from different groups because they are near seagrass beds. So for these, there's a lot of natural sand depression trenches along our coast, scattered throughout the seagrass beds where there's no seagrass, there's no hard bottom. These were the targets for the shallow water reefs. So again, we used the tools back when we started getting permits for these, the imagery, seagrass data, seagrass layers, to pick sites that were void of seagrass as our initial screening. And this is site B, which is a fairly long trench, about 300 feet long, that met all the conditions needed for the shallow water reef. And then once we did this pre-screening, of course, we did the habitat assessments and the scuba service surveys with directional video to show the direction you're doing under or swimming underwater and the distance that you swim, so that you can clearly show there's no habitat in those areas. From my previous days of seagrass mapping, it's really weird thinking seagrass is a bad substrate, but that's what we do for artificial reefs, right? So fortunately, this project was completed thanks to the patience of Larry Beggs back here, who waited very long for the funding to come through. And this was completed in November. And another thing we're doing at these sites is we're going to be using drones to monitor the seagrass beds around these shallow reef reef ball sites. This is after the deployment. You can see the center area of reef balls, but also drift algae is accumulating in those trenches early in the spring. So we're going to use this as a tool. That's site C. And then also just some drone shots from above to make sure that the positions of these things stay in place during storms and there's no migration of the reef balls, which we don't expect. They're heavy. That was part of the permit requirement. And then we'll be doing monitoring starting this weekend on fish using some volunteers called scuba nauts. So lastly, I wanted to mention what we're doing to plan out sites that we're trying to deploy using the restore funds and going through the permitting process. So we're really trying to fit the JAXBO site requirements and to be able to do that more effective, faster permitting process. So we'll start out with seagrass maps. We're doing that right now. Then we'll use the imagery. We'll be visiting the sites on sonar. Wish I had side scan and the technology the FWC has, but counties, we have what we have, and these are the tools. Underwater surveys of the site looks good. And then making sure that site's gonna fit at JAXBO and also is not too close to other hard bottom habitat or seagrass. And again, we're working in the south half of the county where we don't have a lot of the natural hard bottom features that are already existing. So these are some of the maps we're using right now for the new offshore reefs that are around 14 miles offshore. This is 2016 seagrass imagery. The blue is theoretically bare sediment, but we won't know until we get out there with sonar. Some of the other sites to the north are shown as patchy seagrass, but as you see in the aerials look promising because those areas are light colored areas, which hopefully we'll be seeing. and also satellite imagery. So I grab every type of imagery that's out there and use it as a pre-screening tool. These are our inshore reefs we're looking at. As you notice, we're trying to fit all those on the east side of this large mass of great continuous seagrass beds. So most of our shallow reefs will be in this area. And you can see these are our existing 3 reefs we deployed. Another tool that we'll help to utilize is this baseline data I mentioned we're going to fund through the Restore program. So the more data we have on the existing natural hard bottom habitats, I think that's going to help us plan our artificial reefs. And also fisheries data. We want to do some fisheries surveys out there, such as some work that FWC does to see what our existing fisheries data is before we do all these Restore projects. And also, I mentioned we had this flow chart, which we'll be utilizing throughout these projects. So that kind of wraps it up. Our goal is to try to do projects that meet the JAXPO first, and then as we move inland, I think we're going to have to do permitting that's individual permits, because there are some differences between Army Corps and DEP's permit criteria, where, for example, you can't use reef balls to build an oyster reef within the coastal waters under DEP, but you can use them under Army Corps criteria. So those are areas we're going to have to figure out the best way to permit. And then honestly, if we have to go with an individual permit, that project will be completed later than the others with the Restore funds. Does anyone have any questions?
How are you coordinating with shrimpers if you're choosing locations in shrimping areas?
From here on out, we will be meeting with them on where we put these reef ball structures. You'll notice one of those was outside of their shrimping zone. The other 2 are in areas that are close to shore that, from all the experience of the Port Authority members that have lived there a long time, there was a belief there's no shrimping there. So we're gonna tie them into this process. Honestly, there's not a lot of places in the county where you can't shrimp. So just like Citrus County, they shrimp in seagrass beds if that's their living. So that's something we'll have to evaluate. Yes, Keith.
From your review of the aerial imagery of the seagrass boundaries over the years, how much do those boundaries change?
On those trenches, none. I mean, very little. I go back starting with 86, and the resolution is not too good then, but I'll go through all those, make sure that site has been bare for all like that 20-year period. We are seeing declines in seagrass further offshore though. So I'm surprised to see on the recent aerial photography, larger areas of bare sediment offshore. So it's a different subject, but it's kind of concerning that we could be losing grass beds offshore. Yes, Dr. Lindbergh.
Comment on a question first. There was a dissertation done at USF under David Nahr about 10 years ago on artificial reefs in the Gulf.